Welcome to Talking Heads on USA Global TV, starring the one and only wonderful Dr. Jacqueline. It's a prestigious place where world-class influencers and experts meet, and where you'll find the most trusted advisors and coaches for all things in life and business. Visit usaglobaltv.com to sign up for our newsletter, get the value you need, and be first in line to learn about events and giveaways and other valuable content. Connect with us. Email Dr. Jacqueline at usaglobaltv.com to talk about how you can become part of USA Global TV. That's USA Global TV, where the doctor is always in.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to USA Global TV, and hello to our friends listening on Business Talk Radio. I am Dr. Jacqueline Kerbeck, and our show today is Adversity to Awesome. This coincides with my next book, which is coming out April the 4th, which has the same title, Adversity to Awesome. Today, we have with us an international recovery advocate discussing a topic that we have not discussed here on this platform. It's all about the opioid epidemic. Let us welcome to the program, Mr. Robert Kanter. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for having me. It's an honor and privilege to be here, Doctor.
Thank you so much for being here, joining us from New York, Long Island specifically, which is where Business Talk Radio is located.
That's fantastic. I'll have to stop by there. Awesome.
So,
and congratulations on your book, by the way. That's very
thank
exciting.
you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Did you put my story in it? Probably not. Okay.
You'll be in my next book.
Fantastic.
I had to actually cut off because we had, so many people have stories. Everybody has a story to share. And I'm going to come up with another book. So we'll put you in that one for sure. But today, I'm really interested in this topic. We have not addressed this yet, as I mentioned at the top of the show. So, Robert, there's a lot to discuss and cover. I'd like to start off first for people who do not know what it is. What is an international recovery advocate, and what is the opioid epidemic?
So I am in recovery from what we call AUD and SUD, which is AUD is alcohol use disorder and SUD substance use disorder. So alcoholism, but we hate to use the word addiction now because it is attached to a lot of stigma. So we'll say AUD and SUD. So I'm in recovery. I've been in recovery for many years, as is my daughter. And she's also doing well, which is what prompted my advocacy work. And there are a number of advocates around the country that talk about the epidemic, that talk about grassroots organizations and legislation, what's being done in the state of affairs now, because it's not good. My niche, I guess you could say, is that I've taken this advocacy work to an international level, which really other advocates in this country are not doing. So I speak on international networks and international radio, and I write for like the Jerusalem Post and Shingetsu News. I wrote op-eds there to carry the message of recovery and hope, also to let other people in other countries know what is the United States doing legislatively to address the opioid epidemic, what kinds of programs, what kinds of treatment dollars, what kind of legislation, because awareness has been excellent on Capitol Hill. And so all of those things, Doctor, that encompass my recovery, the opioid epidemic here, and the opioid epidemic around the world. For example, in British Columbia and in Canada, they're having a big problem there. And then I'll touch on the fentanyl, which is really, the fentanyl and the pandemic came together to create a perfect storm. And that's why we just passed over 100,000 drug overdose fatalities in a 12-month period last year, it's actually, the numbers keep going up. It's 105,000. So in essence, it's a public health emergency. So hopefully we can discuss this information and I can provide some valuable information to your audience.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Robert, if you would let our audience know a little bit more about your own story, and then we can move into the rest of the topics. But when or what happened that you realized that maybe you needed to speak to somebody, or maybe you needed to make a change?
My life got to a point where it was unbearable from use of alcohol and drugs. And I lived in what we call a bottomless pit of despair. And I just had to be beaten up enough to want to get well and sober more than to want to continue to get drunk and to get high. And I suffered consequences, the rehabs and the police stations and the emergency rooms and all of that stuff. And I don't deserve to be alive. Many people, many of those in recovery will simply say, the amount of substance I put into my body and the dangerous places I went to, and my lack of ability to make clear decisions, we just don't deserve to be alive. And that's something I always carry around in the forefront of my mind. And also my daughter, and I'll touch on her story, will tell you she definitely does not deserve to be alive. She deserves to have overdosed given the amount of heroin that she was using. So when you get to that point of your life being unmanageable, you have to make a decision on whether you want to get help for yourself or whether you do not. And in my case, I've been in 5 rehabs at different times, some of them good, some of them not good. And the last one worked. And from there, I went to what we call a 12-step abstinence-based fellowship program. And my last use was 16 years ago. So I celebrated an anniversary on Christmas Eve of last year, and that was my 16th year. My daughter is now sober over 3 years, and so why wouldn't I speak in the media, doctor? Why wouldn't I try to help at least one person that is struggling with a drug issue, or a family member? And by the way, your listeners or your viewers are more than welcome to email me. And although I'm not a physician, I certainly can give them general information and point them into the proper direction to get the help that they or their loved ones need.
Thank you for your transparency and for offering to help our audience. I really appreciate that. Robert, I remember I was in Philadelphia at a restaurant waiting for someone, a client actually, when I was in my corporate career. And long story short, they had these gold bars on the wall with different patrons' names, people who come often. And the woman sitting next to me, a stranger, she happened to see the name and she mentioned it. And I knew this person extremely well. And I said, "Oh, how do you know XYZ?" And she said, "Oh, I shoot heroin with him." She was in a suit at a very high-end restaurant. And I said, "I'm sorry, what did you say?" And she said it again. And I was dumbfounded because to me, that was a complete that's not anyone I know. They're not people that I associate with. There are other people that, so it is a major problem. And my point of bringing it up, my own naivety, but many people are also naive that people they know, they interact with, they love, are using drugs.
Well, just to give you an example on that point, there are many different things happening in the treatment arena right now that never happened before. For 50 years, drug rehabs, inpatient rehab facilities were all based on the 12-step model of recovery, right? It has completely shifted away from that, doctor. And there's a lot of telehealth, and there are a lot of what's called medication-assisted treatments like Suboxone, Vivitrol. There are just all kinds of therapeutic type programs, wellness programs, and so forth that are out there. And so the treatment landscape has changed. One of the things that is trending is also what's called concierge inpatient. These are individuals that are high net worth men and women. They're in the public eye. Sometimes they're celebrities, and they are individuals that just cannot completely remove themselves from their position. They could be on a board, they could be the owner of a company, and so forth. The traditional model of inpatient treatment is that the individual goes in for at least 28 days and their focus is recovery. They have suffered so many consequences that it is all about building a recovery program around themselves with no distractions. In this concierge model, the individual does that, except that they're allowed to do work on their computer 1 to 2 hours a day. Now, that's controversial, because you're not supposed to be doing work. You're supposed to be focusing on your recovery, right? You hit that, what they call that bottom. But there is such a need for this because there are so many high net worth individuals, particularly on Wall Street, that will not get treatment because they will not put themselves in a general population. A lot of it is stigma, but a lot of it also is sometimes they're the actual brand that are out there. Let's say they're an athlete. A particular facility I know like specializes in having athletes in their concierge program. So to your point, there are many, many people that are high net worth, that are your neighbors, that live in affluent neighborhoods that have problems with drugs. Wouldn't it make sense they could have the drug dealer deliver the drugs right to their doorstep, and the best quality drugs because they can afford them? This goes back to the issue of stigma, where the stigma is that the guy that's shooting heroin is the guy at the train station who's homeless, who hasn't taken a shower, and that's what he does. He's a drug dealer, he's a heroin user, and he's a nobody. That's not the case at all. That's where appearing in the media, for example, is an opportunity to say, let's address the stigma, let's change the language so that you understand it can be your neighbor that is the owner of the company that has a drug problem.
That's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. And Robert, when we think about mental health issues, mental health awareness, and then the recreational use of drugs, where's that line in the sand where it went from somebody smoking pot, for example, to help with, let's say, a medical condition, to somebody having a party and offering cocaine or heroin or something to the people who attend, that's the cool thing to do? When did that change come about, or has it always been in place?
So we have that magical word we call when your life becomes unmanageable. Now, for everyone, that definition is different, but it basically means that from your drug and alcohol use, the consequences become more and more severe, and to the point where it affects your performance at work, or you lose your job, or it's destroying your marriage, it's destroying your finances, it's destroying your physical health. It no longer becomes fun, it becomes a requirement. It's an addiction. You put yourself in dangerous places. And it's so for each individual, they talk about functioning alcoholics. There are many people that can drink to excess and still hold a job. There are many people that cannot. So it's very individual, but the basic premise is, it makes sense that if you go out with your wife and another couple, and they go home you all go home at 11 o'clock at night, you're done with dinner and a few drinks, but you go back out to the bar and stay out till 4 a.m, that would be considered unmanageable, right? And then you're hungover and you go into work late or eventually get fired. So that's kind of when you've crossed that invisible line, and it's different for everyone. For me, it was just simply, making the center of my life the use of drugs, and putting money that I could have used for my daughter's college education and giving it to a drug dealer, or not being employable, or, being bloated and 250 pounds. I could go down the list of consequences where, as I call it, a bottomless pit of despair. It's a dark place. It's a dark place to be, and a place you don't want to have to be, because your life is on the line.
And once a person realizes that they're in this situation, or maybe family or friends or coworkers realize that this is what's going on, what is the first step that needs to take place in order to be on a path of recovery?
Well, the first step is a willingness to want to seek help. And there are many, many resources and ways that you can do that, whether it's something in an inpatient facility, an outpatient facility. There are therapists, there are psychiatrists, there are, organizations in Washington. There are many avenues, excuse me, for someone that can go out and get help. And the best thing to do is use your computer. And again, they're more than welcome to contact me. And there are many different government agencies. There are hotlines. It also depends on really where the person is right now on their journey. Is it something where it's a medical emergency? Is it something where they just really need to be inpatient and be taken off the street? Is it something where it's just getting out of hand and an outpatient program would be desirable? And so it's about doing the research and finding out where the fit is. There are also many community organizations that provide information, support groups, and like I mentioned before, systems navigation. How do you navigate a rehab? So the very first step is to gather information. Unless it's a situation where the person's life is at stake, you want to get them to the emergency room. That's the very first thing you want to do, is so that they are under medical care, They are, they are intubated. They are intravenously fed whatever they're supposed to be fed in terms of the liquids. They are stabilized because you can have serious delirium, serious tremors from alcoholism. Actual alcoholism is more dangerous than the drugs, if you can believe that, with maybe the exception of fentanyl now. But it can be in terms of the withdrawal. It can be. Let me clarify that. They're all dangerous. There's a wealth of information and opportunities and options out there. And the best thing to do is to research. I would start with community organizations that deal with substance use disorder and call them and see the kinds of programs that they have, because generally they will have support groups, they will have hotlines, and they will have individual social workers that can give you the information tailored more to the individual that's suffering to steer them in the right direction. So it's about doing your research first. It's about reaching out to many different resources, whether it's community organizations, calling inpatient programs, calling a therapist, calling an interventionist. There's plenty out there, and then kind of tailoring the direction you want to take that individual based on where they're at on their journey right now. But again, if they're, if they've almost overdosed, you get them to the emergency room. If they're, turning yellow, if they're haven't eaten for 3 days, you want to get them that immediate medical care. And then from there, the hospitals are very good these days now of getting a social worker involved immediately and then going from there. Do you want to go directly? Like in my case, they always wanted to send me directly to inpatient because I ended up at the emergency room so many times. And many times I said, okay. And when the doctor and nurse walked out of the room, what did I do? I threw my clothes on and ran out of the hospital because I wasn't ready. Finally, I got so sick that I said, okay, I'm ready. And I went directly to rehab and then to a sober living home. And then, and then I was able to function in society. So there's a lot out there that people can choose from.
And you just hit on a point that I was going to ask about. What if the person is not accepting responsibility and they're in denial? I don't have a problem.
Okay, that's a great question. Outside of them stating that they're going to hurt themselves or hurt someone else, there's nothing you can do. Absolutely nothing. You can try disowning them, cutting them off from their finances. You can cut them off from their finances. They'll go on the street and they'll sell their body and they'll sell their last, possession, and they'll deal drugs. They're going to do what they're going to do to keep their habit going, right? To keep their drug use going until they are ready, until they've had enough and they want to seek treatment more than they want to keep suffering. And that's the point here, is we talk about separating the illness from the individual. These are individuals that suffer from a disease. The AMA has classified it as a disease like any other disease, like kidney failure or heart condition or diabetes, and they should be treated with compassion, with boundaries, right? But with compassion, as if someone else who would be sick, and you would help them medically, not to stigmatize them, not to disown them, not to try to punish the problem away. And I can talk about the Portugal model of harm reduction, which is also very interesting to that point, perhaps later on in the broadcast.
Thank you for clarifying that. And is it possible that the person is afraid of how their life is going to change? Because I would think their friends are going to change, the routines are going to change. So that's got to be a huge amount of information to take in and process and accept.
I think you embrace both. You take a deep breath and say, thank God I'm in a safe place. But at the same time, you're saying, what the hell am I doing? What's going on here? I have to not take a drink for the rest of my life. I have to hang out with these wacky people who want to sit in support groups and talk about their feelings, right? I have to change all my friends, like you just said. I have to not go to the places. I cannot drink with my college buddies anymore. Oh my God, what is this? My whole life, my life is over. You hear that many times in recovery. I came to recovery and my life is over, when really your life just begins. You just have to be in enough pain, doctor, and I'm sure you know about this more than me. You have to be in enough pain and suffering enough where you say, okay, show me how to get help. Teach me how to live a life as an alcoholic, for example, because I have no clue. You have to be finished. You have to be done. And until you reach that point, there is nobody that's going to convince you They can try interventions. Sometimes interventions are great. Sometimes they're not. Parents try everything in the book to try to help their children. The kids have to be ready. And I call them, I have a 27-year-old daughter. I still call her my, kid, but she's a young adult. That's that, the disease takes you to a very dark place until you're so beaten down and beaten up that you really come to a point where if you know in your heart that if you don't stop, you're going to kill yourself. You have that realization. That's how bad it is. Yes, you've destroyed your marriage and you've lost your job and your health and you're broke and all that. But when you really feel like you're going to be dead from this, that's kind of where you say, okay, it's time.
That's the wake-up call.
That's exactly what it is. It's a wake-up call.
And you also mentioned the physical withdrawal. What happens to a person once they make the decision and they're not going to do drugs or alcohol? Their body goes through a process?
Yes, and I'm not a medical doctor, but basically when you've consumed a large amount of alcohol and drugs, you need a detox period. And some people actually detox at home, which I absolutely do not recommend. Some people that are really, really bad shape should go to the hospital so they can detox in a detox bed there. And there are inpatient rehabs that have detoxification units there, which is one that my daughter went to, where you specifically are observed by medical individuals, by physicians and nurses, to make sure that nothing adverse happens to your body as you taper off these drugs. And yes, detox can be very painful and it can be very frightening. And many people run out of detox, and I'll share with you a term I actually learned from my daughter, but it can be a very dangerous time. So that's a scenario where if someone has almost overdosed or they really have consumed a lot of drugs and they've been up for days, you want to make sure their body is medically properly detoxed of those drugs and alcohol. And you do that in a medical facility. And that's what I'm talking about there is that, if that individual or family member is in that position, you want to get them to the hospital. That's the bottom line. You want to get them to the hospital. Let them stabilize. And then with your resources and your social workers, with your doctor, you can say, okay, what's the next step from here? Oh, I was gonna mention this term that I learned from my daughter called spin drying, which I'd never heard before. Spin drying is when a young adult needs to go to detox because they're very sick. It's not just a young adult, but let's say it's a man, a young adult in his 20s, okay, a guy. And he has no intention of staying in detox. But what happens is they detox him and he's there for the purpose of removing the drugs from his body so that when he leaves and goes back on the streets or goes back to using the drugs, he needs less of that drug to get him to that same euphoric place, and then he saves money. If that makes any sense, it's called spin drying. They go specifically to detox knowing they're going to leave. And so now is before the detox where they had to keep doing enormous amounts of that drug to get the same high, the same effect. Now, because they've been detoxed and that drug is out of their system, they don't need as much. And so it's a way for them to go back out, use the detox as a tool to go out, get the drugs, but have to use less of the drugs, if this makes any sense, to get the same euphoria that they got from the more using drugs before they got into detox. It's incredible that they do this, but it's very common.
Wow, that's a lot. There's a lot of planning in that, it seems. And you mentioned that you wouldn't recommend detoxing at home. Is that because the process itself of detoxing can kill a person?
Yes, exactly. It can kill someone. They could be in such pain. They could go up to the top floor and jump off the roof. They could be in such bad shape that they'll grab anything. Alcoholics will drink, vanilla extract and mouthwash and anything that has alcohol in it. They'll grab it if they have to have it. If someone's addicted to opioids, they'll go into the medicine cabinet and they'll try to find opioids or Valiums or Ambiens. And if not, they go into their friends' parents' medicine cabinet and do the same thing. We won't stop at anything. There will be nothing that'll stop us except if we're dead or in the emergency room or in handcuffs. That's pretty much how we're stopped. unless we're ready to get help. So let me just be clear, doctor. You do not want to detox at home. I'm just saying there have been some people that have done it because they're so afraid to go to the outside world and seek treatment. But it's a very, very dangerous proposition, and you could lose your life.
You're sharing so many really important points here, and there's a lot more to discuss, but we're going to take a quick break and hear from some of our sponsors, and then we'll be back with Robert to share more information with us. So for now, let's take a moment and we'll be back.
Take a moment.
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 So I've had the privilege of photographing some incredible people over the years, and during each shoot I've asked the subject to close their eyes and take themselves to a peaceful place just for a few seconds. I've found that this really helps to refresh the energy between the camera and the subject. They had an energy that was quite special and quite different from the rest of the shoot. The collection grew, and now it feels the right time to use it for something good. I think it'd be amazing if we could help to raise awareness and involve people in the discussion about mental health. So what we're asking to do is for everyone to upload their own self-portraits. All of these portraits will become part of a massive artwork. I'm really excited to see this project go from hundreds of pictures to thousands of pictures. Essentially, an ever-evolving artwork that says we're all in this together.
Close your eyes and take a moment.
Меня зовут Маша, мне 9 лет, я живу в Красногоровке, у меня все хорошо. Кушать у нас есть, пить у нас есть, сахар у нас есть, все есть. Только дров не хватает. На буржуйке, когда у нас есть, вот эти мы дрова пособираем, закинем, оно горит. Например, в 10 запалили, в 11 закончили, вода нагрелась, еще и мы купаемся.
В наш дом 4 было прямых попаданий, так что мы боимся человека, даже осколками поранило, забрали в больницу с 6-го подъезда соседа, так что мы тоже боимся, у нас много деток, деваться нам некуда, нас никто нигде не ждет.
Когда вырасти, я хочу найти работу такую, чтобы я помогала людям, которые бедные, там.
welcome back to USA Global TV and Business Talk Radio. I'm Dr. Jacqueline Kerbeck, and our show today is Adversity to Awesome. And we are talking about the opioid epidemic. We're here with international recovery advocate Robert Kanter. Nice to see you again.
Thank you for having me the second time. I appreciate it. I always thought you might dump me, after it was a bad interview. I don't know. You know what I was thinking, doctor, is my work is on an international scope. I did an interview on Al Jazeera and TRT World, Canadian National Television. And being that the name of your program is Global Television, or the name of your organization, we could come up with some synergies to carry your message and your guests along with my advocacy work to some of these international networks and stations, so they know about your shows as well and they can tune in.
Oh, I appreciate that. That would be fabulous, because we are a global platform. We have co-hosts in Africa and in the UK, Scotland, London. Yeah, so let's discuss that. That would be great.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So you mentioned earlier about a certain model that you wanted to discuss. Can you share more about that?
Right, the Portugal model of harm reduction. So I got sober, and then my daughter almost overdosed on heroin. She was locked in an apartment with a drug dealing boyfriend, and we just couldn't. My wife at the time we couldn't just get access to her, and she was killing herself. And you can imagine, as a father of my only child, you can imagine what went through my head. In the past, we stigmatized her, we disowned her, we basically told her she was a failure. Get your act together. And then I read about the Portugal model of harm reduction. Real briefly, I believe it's 20 years ago, the country of Portugal had a heroin epidemic. And they did something very bold. They took the problem out of their criminal justice system. They brought it into their Ministry of Health. And any person that had less than a 10-day supply of drugs, they were not charged with a crime. They went in what was front of what was called a dissuasion committee, a physician, a social worker, an attorney, and they work together with that individual, treating them as someone that's suffering from an illness, giving them what's called harm reduction tools, access to support groups, access to, shelter, information on inpatient programs, all kinds of different things. And by doing that, by taking that approach, by not taking the war on drugs approach, they reduced their heroin epidemic by 75%. So we managed to get my daughter out of that apartment she was locked in, and to meet my wife and I at a diner. This is in upstate New York, and had this conversation where we didn't stigmatize her. I told her about my recovery. I said, we understand that you're in a bad place. We want to help you. You're not going to come into the living room and shoot dope, or shoot heroin and watch Netflix. That's not going to happen. But if you want us to drive you to Detox right now, let's do it. If you want to, we're going to help you in any way we can. We want to meet you where you are. We understand your suffering. We love you, and you are part of the family. She left that diner. My wife and I were crying. We just didn't know what to do. And an hour later, she showed up with all her belongings in a garbage bag. And she said, okay, drive me to Detox. And she detoxed there for 5 days, went to an inpatient rehab program for 28 days, a sober living facility. They call it a halfway house or transitional living, and is now sober 3.5 years. That conversation, she will tell you that didn't get her sober. I don't take any ownership for that, doctor, but that conversation, she will tell you, changed her perspective and said, whoa, they understand I'm suffering. Whoa, they do love me. They're not stigmatizing me. And that allowed the door to open for her to get the help. So that model of separating, as we say, separating the illness from the individual can save lives. And in my advocacy work, I encourage families to have these conversations with their kids, as I call them, their loved ones, and say, we need to set boundaries. We're not going to throw money away. We're not going to let you abuse us, but we will support you. We love you. We want you to get well. Let's work together. That's, I encourage them to have loving, destigmatized conversations, because it's life. You don't want to stigmatize them and say, get out of the house, and have them end up on the streets where their life is really at danger. You want them in a medical facility. You want them in a program, and you want them to know that they are part of the family and that you do love them and you will support them as long as they get the help that they need to get.
That sounds like a really great approach, a wonderful model to use as opposed to the other.
Yes, because if you recall, President Nixon's, and not to say I'm not a President Nixon fan, or I am a fan, but his war on drugs of many years ago was a colossal failure. It's a colossal failure. Where is the treatment for those, especially individuals from marginalized communities? They're put in jail, and how does that get them better? How does that treat their illness? It doesn't. You want to treat their illness before they end up incarcerated. You don't want to treat it when it's there. They've already damaged their lives if they're even going to get out of being incarcerated. So it's about treatment. It's about destigmatizing. It's about being there to give them harm reduction tools and to support them and understand that they're suffering and it's an illness, and to have access to the treatment, which is why legislation and funding is so important, so that the treatment is available, especially in marginalized communities, in Black communities, and where they're just screwed out of the gate. Like, the treatment's not there. They're in impoverished areas and they just don't have the same access and the same socioeconomic situations that, let's say, I have. I'll speak for myself. That's where the solution lies. It's not a war. It's about treatment. It's about treatment.
And to go through the detox process, what type of money does that take? I mean, and do you have to have, like, where do you get the money from if you don't have money?
Well, you can detox at, public hospitals. I guess you'd call them city hospitals. You can detox at any hospital, whether it's, Weill Cornell, or whether it's Bellevue or whatever, or a city hospital. They will always detox you. They have to. They're required by law. They can't let you out because you could die. Once you go to the emergency room and you're seeking treatment, they have to stabilize you medically. But there's the trick. Once you're stabilized medically in 2 days or 3 days, now what happens? Most of these individuals just pack their stuff and run back out to their drug dealers, right? That's why that intervention of a social worker is so critical at that point, where the social worker and the nurse and the physician could say, look, it really would be a good idea if you go directly to a drug rehab. There are many state-run drug rehabs where it doesn't cost any money. There are more inexpensive ones. And then, and this is where insurance comes into play, and what we call, I touched on systems navigation. How do you make sure you're properly compensated by your insurance company? Because there's something called parity laws, where the insurance companies are supposed to treat addiction like every other major illness and pay for it accordingly, and they don't. So, United Healthcare, there was just a big settlement. I know the individual is a colleague of mine at a law firm, Zuckerman Spader. They finally got $10 million out of United Healthcare, because what was happening is someone would go into inpatient treatment, and after 2 weeks, they'd have to recertify, and United Healthcare and the many other insurance companies would say, no, we're not going to give you any money. 2 weeks is enough. And they would leave. And 2 weeks is a drop in the bucket for someone to get the help that they need. So that systems navigation, to understand it, is extremely important. And that goes back to the point of making sure you do your research. The Kennedy Forum is a great source on Robert Kennedy, on the parity laws. They've been advocating and politicking on that for many, many years. So to answer your question, because I tend to get very passionate about this, Doctor, that again, there are state-run organizations. In New York, it's called Oasis, and there would be in your state as well. There is treatment for those who don't have the funds.
That's really important for people to know. So if you want to get help, there is help available regardless of what your financial situation is, it sounds like.
Absolutely. It won't be the fanciest inpatient rehab, but you're not in there for fancy. You're not in there for a chef. You're in there to get well. You're in there to completely focus on stabilizing and getting your life back on track, and building a foundation of recovery, so that when you leave that inpatient facility, you have a plan on how to stay sober, and you have resources on how to stay sober, and you have hope on how to stay sober. And that's where these resources are so critical. So no, there is definitely help for any individual that wants help if they can't afford it. There's no question about that. But specific to detox, you go to the nearest hospital. You take that loved one, or you take yourself and you go to the nearest hospital by ambulance, and you say, I'm withdrawing, I need a hospital bed, and you go. And that's the first step, to stabilize and be under medical care.
I'd like to talk a little bit about where the drugs come from and why is it seemingly so available. Just from watching Netflix shows, there's drugs everywhere. They're bringing in from this country and that country, or it's the prescription drugs that somehow people get a hold of because they had a back problem, for example. So can you kind of narrow that down for us as to how the drugs get to where they are?
Right. Well, that goes back to the the opioid epidemic. So you have drugs that have been birthed in the United States. Fentanyl is the culprit right now. Fentanyl is one of the moving reasons that overdose fatalities are happening. Fentanyl is manufactured in China. It's brought into South America, and for the most part, the Mexican cartels are smuggling it into the United States. It's cheap to produce. It's very powerful. It comes in very small vials, so it's easy to smuggle in. It's being what we call cut into these other illegal drugs, such as heroin and methamphetamine, and even in marijuana, even in cocaine. The fentanyl is lethal. So it's not back in the days, and in my day when I used drugs and we had what was called Quaaludes and pot and cocaine, was not nearly as dangerous as it is now with the fentanyl. Now, on the flip side, you have the opioid epidemic. The Purdue pharmaceutical company, and what we call the Sackler family, or we refer to, or unscrupulous physicians, or pharmacies, or distributors, drug distributors like McKesson, Cardinal Health, AmerisourceBergen. They are not what started the opioid epidemic. It was the Food and Drug Administration. And there's a great segment on 60 Minutes, if you Google it, about the corruption in the FDA and how they did not do their job as the gatekeepers to protect the public from unscrupulous pharmaceutical companies like Purdue Pharma. Purdue Pharma, the distributors who distributed the opioids around the country, the physicians, some of them that wrote these ridiculous amounts of pills, the pill mills, they just jumped on the train. They jumped on for the ride because of the amount of money to be made, and they're certainly culpable. But the source, the beginning, in my opinion, is the Food and Drug Administration. And again, there's they have individuals they interview, and the corruption, and you have to understand the commissioners of the FDA, for the most part, when they're done at the FDA, they go to Big Pharma. So you can see the conflict of interest there.
That's new information. I wasn't aware of that.
I don't mean to interrupt you. So the point is that because of that, the opioids, and there's still an epidemic with the opioids, don't get me wrong, are coming from physicians that are writing here. They're writing the scripts that, for patients where it's not necessary, where the dosage is not correct. On the streets, the opioids are still getting on the streets here. So they're being manufactured here in the United States. The other drugs like fentanyl, methamphetamine are coming in. Some meth is also produced here. It's coming in from various sources, to answer your question, because there's such a hunger for them. And especially with the pandemic, when we were locked down and there was less access to treatment, and the stress involved, and you would know more about this than me, the post-traumatic stress that occurred, and the fact that the detox beds for substance use disorder were now being converted into COVID beds. So there were no beds. And then in drug inpatient rehabs, they might have 50 beds available for, inpatient guests. But now they had to be quarantined. So there might have been 3 guests in a townhome or in a facility to one room. Now you can't do that. So you lose 2 beds because you have to quarantine one of the patients. And so COVID just did a number. And then you take that with fentanyl, and plus all the stress, and you would know more about that, and it just became a perfect storm. And literally, we went from like 70,000 drug overdoses 2 years ago to like 105,000 now. I mean, it's a true public health emergency. President Biden just had a speech on mental health not too long ago, and the Supreme Court is actually hearing a case right now relating to what is the proper amount of dosage that physicians should be prescribing. there's a lot going on in this space and a lot of awareness, and as it should, because the monies are needed for treatment and it's a public health emergency. And this doesn't seem to be any relief in sight. That's the frightening part.
And with these drugs like fentanyl and heroin and cocaine, are there legitimate uses for them that they could be prescribed for something, or are they all basically recreational use?
Heroin, well, this is an interesting topic because psychedelic drugs now for medical use are becoming very popular, just like marijuana. So, of course, there's medical marijuana, so that has medicinal value. Psychedelic drugs have medicinal value. I'm not a physician, so I can't tell you. I don't think cocaine does. I don't think meth does. Certainly, opioids have a legitimate medical use. There's no question. So I'm not a physician, but I can tell you some of them do, and some of them don't, and some of them, some of them don't. Is what I would expect. I can't see the medicinal value. I don't know of any heroin that is administered by any physician for any kind of recovery program or treatment for substance use disorder or withdrawal or anything, like a Suboxone, for example. I've never heard that before, but I could be wrong.
And if there were some way to eliminate these drugs so that they didn't exist anymore, would it just be that a person switched to something else?
Yes.
Yeah.
Something else to get that euphoric feeling, to take them out of themselves, and to use for whatever way it makes them feel. You call it an escape, you call it euphoria, you call it whatever, to deal with trauma, whatever the person's need is. But at the end of the day, for me, I will speak for me, I use substances because it gave me a euphoric feeling and brought me to a happy place. Brought me to a place where I could suspend every obligation and every feeling and every worry and just be at a place where I was happy. Unfortunately, there were consequences that followed that.
Now, when you were going through that, had you tried other approaches such as, I'm just going to throw it out there, meditation, affirmations, working on loving yourself? Had you tried any of those things?
Well, I've been sober 16 years. So back when I first got sober, as I mentioned earlier, the 12-step model of recovery was the main premier approach of recovery, right? Those are the fellowship meetings where you get a mentor, and most people know what I'm talking about. I don't like to mention in the media the names of the organizations because it's against the traditions. They're meant to stay anonymous. That's why I don't mention them. But that's what I subscribe to. Right now, the trend in recovery in the recovery community is completely away from the 12-step model. And there are just all kinds of there are wellness approaches. There's yoga, there's retreats, there's wilderness programs, there's brain mapping, there's something called neuroplasticity, retraining the mind. There are all kinds of pathways to recovery that didn't exist before, and then medication-assisted treatment. And I support every one of those pathways to recovery, right? We're all on the same team. And I encourage people where if one pathway doesn't work, try another one. Try another, try a support group, try medication-assisted treatment, try, whatever, and however many you could do at the same time, try them. Because we're very fortunate. There is so much different type of help out there, so many different types of programs and approaches you can take to get well. And some people do get well. I know people that don't subscribe to a 12-step program, that don't take any kinds of medications, that are we call spiritual. They meditate and they live a very clean, healthy lifestyle, and they just don't drink. They had a problem with it. They don't drink, and they're not in any kind of recovery program. They just have created a healthy lifestyle that seems to be enough for them. But it's not a one-size-fits-all.
That makes a lot of sense. It really is customized to the individual person and what it's going to take to keep them in a place of inner peace and self-care and really loving and respecting themselves.
Absolutely. And that's a good point you touch on is, You know, you gain a lot of things back when you get sober, but one of it is your self-respect and self-esteem. And you don't, you don't compromise yourself. You don't make poor decisions. You make decisions that are best for your life and your peace of mind and for your health. You surround yourself with healthier people. You go to healthier places. You do healthier things. These are all the benefits of stopping the use of the drugs and the alcohol.
Robert, I'm going to have to say this is part one of our interview because we have to have you back. There's so much more to discuss. We have a show right after this. I'm going to spotlight you, and your banner is showing. But for people on the radio who can't read it and people who really want to reach out, they're looking for some support. What's the best way to get in touch with you, and who would you like to contact you?
Well, my email is should be right there, robert@robertkanter.org. It's KANTER, robert@robertkanter.org. Feel free to email me with any questions, and I will direct you as best you can and give you as much information that's appropriate. And any individual, any family member that's suffering, that has someone in their family suffering, a friend, you can all reach out to me. There's no, they say it's a family disease. The people we hurt the most are the people we love the most. Anyone suffering from an addiction, anyone that is married to someone, anyone that has a child, anyone that has a close friend, reach out to me.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure and honor to meet you. And I hope you'll come back and see us again because as I mentioned, there's so much more to discuss and so many people to help.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to that. And thank you for carrying the message. It's very important, Doctor. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be in touch with you later today.
Okay. Bye-bye. Have a great day.
Bye. Thanks, you too. Bye. Thank you, everyone who is watching us on the live or whether you're watching us on the replay. I suggest, because we stream in so many places, that you go to our website, usaglobaltv.com. You can find our shows there. You can also find them on our YouTube channel, which is USA Global TV. And please, if you're there, do subscribe. If you do need help, if you feel you're alone, you're struggling, please do reach out to Robert. I know he'll be happy to help you. Just don't go through it by yourself because there's no reason to. There's so many places and people, organizations that are there to help. So once again, I appreciate each and every one of you. I thank you for your support and being on this journey with me here at USA Global TV. We're going to sign off for now because the United Kitchens is coming up right in 7.5 minutes. So you stay where you are and I'll rush over to the other studio. And I look forward to what Chef Ricky is cooking up today. I think it is chicken breasts with goat cheese and vegetables. So stay tuned. We'll be back shortly. Bye.